it's not just the majority of Americans who have turned against the war. Increasingly, Ukrainian men are doing everything possible to avoid being sent to the front lines because they know they will be used as cannon fodder in what they obviously view as a futile effort. The way they're trying to break through Russian entrenched defensive positions is these sort of probes where they send Ukrainian soldiers and see where they get killed, and they know those aren't weak spots. And then the ones where they don't get instantly killed, those are the parts that they think are sort of softer targets. So they're just sacrificing men by the thousands in what looks like, at least for now, a futile effort to break through the entrenched Russian lines. And Ukrainians see this war better than the West does, that's for sure. It is true, all dissent in Ukraine is abolished. Anyone in the media who raises opposition or objections to the war will be prosecuted, will be arrested. We're about to show you a Ukrainian pacifist who's currently being charged with treason for his view that the war is wrong on pacifistic grounds. There's no democracy of any kind in Ukraine. Zelensky is the leader under martial law indefinitely. Even before the war, Zelensky was closing media outlets, TV stations that he viewed as oppositional, shutting political parties. And since the war began, there's just no political dissent of any kind in Ukraine. And part of that repression is increasingly cracking down on Ukrainian men who are trying either to flee Ukraine, leave Ukraine by bribing people to do so, or by just risking their lives to get out by fleeing in very dangerous ways, including exposing themselves to very cold weather or just the elements in order to get to Romania or get to Russia even, because the borders are closed. They don't let anybody out. Zelensky's not fighting with the volunteer army. He's fighting with the conscript army. And even though they're being bombarded with propaganda where dissent is not allowed, they see that this war is something they don't want to fight in. Here from The Guardian today. The Guardian, of course, is, like most British outlets, very, very vocally in favor of the Ukraine in the war. So you know that it must be very extreme if they're willing to report this. Quote, bribes and hiding at home, the Ukrainian men trying to avoid conscription. Some are spending life savings to stay out of the war, but such actions are seen as treasonous by those already fighting. Quote, it is believed that tens of thousands of Ukrainian men have left the country illegally since the full-scale war with Russia started last February, many by paying bribes. On Friday, the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky fired every regional military recruitment head in the country, citing endemic corruption in the apparatus. Odessa, now I just want to stop here and just note, as a kind of side observation, that as soon as this war began, the Western media stopped saying things about Ukraine that had been saying for a full decade, such as it's dominated by neo-Nazi battalions, such as the Azov battalion. They just overnight changed their narrative about Ukraine. But one of the other things that they did was they started using completely different spelling for the cities of Ukraine, for names in Ukraine, because they didn't want to be accused of using the Russian version or the Putin version, even though that had always been how they spelled these names forever. They always used to write Odessa with two S's. They used to spell Kyiv, K-I-E-V. Now it's K-Y-I-V. Odessa's with one S, because if they don't do that, they get accused of using the Kremlin or the Putin version. And so they just are so easily coerce these media outlets into printing what they're told to print. It seems like a small example, but it exemplifies the mentality under which they're working. Odessa has emerged as a particular hotspot for draft evasion schemes, with a recruitment office official arrested after he was found to have $5 million in savings in a lavish property in Spain. But across Ukraine, there are reports of corrupt officials willing to take bribes from people eager to buy their way out of the draft. There are more than 100 other criminal proceedings against enlistment officials. In the first weeks after the invasion, hundreds of thousands of ordinary Ukrainians volunteered to serve at the front in an explosion of patriotism that helped keep the country independent and fight off the initial attack. That's the problem, is those kind of fighters, the ones eager to fight, the ones capable of fighting, many of them have been killed, and they're left with people who aren't trained to fight, who aren't capable of fighting, and who don't want to fight. and they're forced against their will to do so with the threat of long-time prison or a treason prosecution under martial law. Quote, more than a year later, however, many of those initial recruits are now dead, wounded, or simply exhausted, and the Army needs new recruits to fill the ranks. By now, most of those who want to fight have already signed up, leaving the military to recruit among a much more reluctant pool of men. Fathers of more than 3 children, people with disabilities, and those working in strategically important jobs are exempt from the draft, but everyone else is expected to join up if called. Crews of mobilization officers roam the streets and sometimes go door to door to hand out notices. Viral videos show officers bundling men into vans to deposit them at enlistment offices. The stakes have left many people reluctant to comply with mobilization calls, and those who receive the initial set of papers often lock themselves away to avoid being dragged to the recruitment office. Now, the United States has used conscript armies before and prosecuted draft dodgers as well, including during Vietnam. Lots of armies do. Russia is also fighting with conscript armies. But it's important, looking outside, as somebody who's being told that you have to support this war, that a lot of men in Ukraine don't even want to do this fighting. And President Zelensky, as I said at the start of the show, at the start of the war, urged Westerners to go and help Ukraine fight the Russian army because he knew that Russia has a much smaller, or the Ukraine has a much smaller population than Russia, and therefore much less access to fighting men, which is a major disadvantage in war, and yet so few Westerners who beat their chest about the nobility and the urgency of defeating Russia were willing to go and fight. And so Ukraine is and increasingly to crack down on their own population. The people we're told are being defended in this war, but who in fact are dying in it against their will. Politico in February, so this has been going on for months, reported that Ukraine army discipline has a crackdown and it sparks fears of fury on the front. Quote, critics say new legislation that punishes deserters and rule breakers more harshly contravenes human rights and demotivates military personnel. So they've been increasingly extreme about imposing more and more punishments, severe punishments. You can go to years in prison. And Ukrainian men are willing to not fight in this war, which is a violation of human rights conventions, because forcing people to fight and die in a war against their will is a very extreme action, even if sometimes it's justified. But it shows you, for those of you who think it's justified, but it shows you the mindset of Ukraine, much different than the media narrative we've been fed, the one that's inspiring and uplifting about the feisty Ukrainians. Here from the Kiev Post in January of this year, Zelensky signs controversial law toughening punishment for desertion in army. Soldiers could face up to 12 years in prison for desertion and up to 10 years for disobedience. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky on Wednesday signed a controversial law toughening punishments for disobedience or desertion from the armed forces amid Russia's invasion. Stronger sanctions will also apply to offenses such as threatening commanders, fleeing the battlefield, or consuming alcohol, according to the law published on the Ukrainian parliament's website. The new law also prohibits courts from giving reduced or suspended sentences to soldiers found guilty. Soldiers could face up to 12 years in prison for desertion, 10 years for disobedience or refusal to fight, and up to 7 years for threatening a superior. You can really tell the kind of breakdown of morale in Ukraine, and I don't blame anyone in Ukraine for that. This is a brutal war that Ukraine does not appear capable of winning in terms of expelling Russia from all their territory. And if you look at that, and you're seeing how many people are being maimed and killed in a futile cause, it's normal human instinct to want to avoid that. And if Ukrainians aren't willing to fight in this war, then why is the West, why is the United States being told that while we have all sorts of social pathologies, we have to spend huge amounts of our own resources on this war, a war that Westerners would not go and fight when asked? Here's the Guardian article I referenced about Zelensky at the start of the war. Quote, Ukraine appeals for foreign volunteers to fight against Russia. Quote, President Zelensky issues call to arms to foreign nationals in battle against Russian war criminals. You know, if there's anything that sickens me, it is pundits and politicians who never got near a war, who evaded wars, but who cheerlead wars from a safe distance to give themselves purpose and a feeling of strength. as long as it's other people having to go fight and die in those wars and other people's kids having to fight as well in them. And that's basically the entire Western punditry class, the entire Western media class, and a good amount of Western politics is characterized by exactly that. At least in the wars of the 17th and 18th century, European royalty used to go to the front lines and fight because there was a sense that if the monarch wasn't willing to go fight or their families weren't willing to go fight, then the war itself was not justified enough to ask people to go fight in those wars as well. We've lost every conceivable sense of that. I mean, in Vietnam, the elite just basically did not go to war, even though there was a draft. That's why so many of these boomer politicians who talked so tough during the war on terror, like Dick Cheney, didn't get near war. They found all sorts of ways to get out of it. Democracy Now!, which is a program that used to do a lot of good things that no longer does, it's pretty much indistinguishable from MSNBC, to their credit, had a Ukrainian pacifist whom they interviewed, and he's currently been charged with treason for doing nothing other than on pacifistic grounds opposing his country's war with Russia. I warn you that his English is very, very halting in a way that I found disturbing to listen to or just difficult to listen to, but I'm going to show it to you anyway because it's important to hear what he's saying, because we're being told we're fighting for Ukrainian democracy, and yet, at least since the US was involved in picking Ukraine's government by removing its leader before his office was up, and certainly now, whatever you want to call what's going on in Ukraine and call President Zelensky, it has nothing to do with democracy. Let's listen to this Ukrainian peace activist.
It's total nonsense that a pacifist is accused in justification of war for anti-war statement. This peace agenda for Ukraine and the world, it denounces Russian aggression. It quotes United Nations General Assembly resolution which denounces Russian aggression. We must understand that any violations of international law are not appropriate in contemporary international order. We should strengthen democratic and legal foundations of
Okay, I just want to stop it there. I don't want to be critical of him. I know from experience that it's not easy to speak in a second or third language in a interview in the media if you're not accustomed to it. But the message is more important than the delivery of it, which is a good thing because the delivery is quite awful. But the message, this is a Ukrainian citizen. He's a pacifist. He doesn't believe in war. It's his ideology. It's his conviction. He's didn't just become that to avoid the war. He's been this for a long time. You see the paraphernalia all around him, and he's being prosecuted and convicted as a traitor to his country simply for advocating pacifism and anti-war messaging. That's the Ukrainian democracy that we're fighting for. Now, thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.